All righty. Today we're going to read pages 158 to 170. A husband for Penelope. As a rosy dawn crept across the sky, Penelope was down in the storeroom fetching Odysseus's great bow. She picked it up with a long string hanging loose and found a quiver full of arrows. Then she ordered Euryclea to bring up all the bronze and iron axes and that Odysseus had won as trophies. By the time the suitors arrived, everything was ready for the contest. Telemachus had set up the axes in a line down the center of the hall, and Penelope was sitting by the hearth with a great bow in her hand. "This is how I shall choose my next husband," she announced. "I shall marry the man who can string the bow and use it to shoot an arrow through the loops of all these axes." "I must attempt it too," Telemachus said. "No one shall touch my father's bow before I've tried my strength and skill." There, look at the axes. Oh, wow. A contest of strength and skill. He picked up the bow in his hands. Oh, I wonder if we could have seen more picture. Oh, I think nope, we couldn't. He picked up the bow with both hands. He tried 3 times. He tried to bend it, but he couldn't quite loop the string into place. And at the fourth attempt, he might have managed it, but Odysseus warned him off with a tiny shake of his head that wouldn't fit their plan. As soon as Telemachus put down the bow, the suitors came crowding forward, each determining to pass the test and to win Penelope. One by one, they picked up the bow and struggled to string it, but no one was strong enough. While they were struggling, Odysseus stepped outside the hall and went to find Eumaeus. "Faithful friend," he said, "it's time to tell you who I am." He parted his rags to show the long silvery scar on his leg. And when Eumaeus saw it, his face lit up and opened his mouth to shout for joy. "Stay quiet," hissed Odysseus. "First we shall drive out these wicked men. Go around the hall and lock all the other doors so that no one can escape." "It will be a pleasure," Eumaeus said fiercely. "And when I've done that, I'll come back to fight with you. And I'll bring the cowherd with me. You still have a few loyal servants here." He set off at once, and Odysseus slipped back into the hall to watch the next man wrestling with his bow. Oh, look. No luck. Look, they're trying so hard. No luck. There were more than 100 men, and the contest lasted all day. One suitor after another came forward, eager to take his turn, and one by one they failed, abandoning their hopes of passing the bow on to the next man. Finally, as the sun began to set, the last suitor laid the bow aside, and a hush fell over the hall. Odysseus stepped forward. "Lady," he said to Penelope, "may I try the bow?" The suitors were outraged. They began to shout at him, but Penelope waved them aside. "Yes, you may try," she said, "and if you succeed, I won't marry you, but you'll have a rich reward." Telemachus pretended to be outraged too. "You let a beggar touch my father's bow? Go to bed, mother. This is a matter for men." Penelope bowed her head and left them, and Odysseus picked up his bow. Ignoring the jeers of the suitors, he ran his hands over the wood. When he was sure it was sound, he bent the bow easily and slipped the string into place. A silence fell over the hall. Odysseus plucked the bowstrings, and it gave out a note as clear as a swallow's song, and then he took the arrow and set it on the string, taking aim at the axes. Moving so that all of the rings were in a line, he drew back the arrow and paused for a second. Then he let it go. The arrow sped straight and true, flying through every one of the axe rings. It buried itself in the wall at the far end of the hall, and Odysseus turned to Telemachus. "I have not disgraced you, my son," he said. "Now let's give your suitors their supper and see them dance." "Yes, father," said Telemachus. With horror, the suitors realized who the beggar really was, and Odysseus moved to the main doorway, and Telemachus sprang to the side, sword and spear in hand. Eumaeus and the other cowherd stepped up behind them, and Odysseus took another arrow from his quiver. The suitors began to panic, especially when they discovered that all of the doors were locked. "We'll pay for every mouthful we've eaten," they've babbled. "We'll give you piles of gold and herds of oxen, if only you'll let us go." "Gold and oxen can't pay for what you've done," Odysseus said fiercely. "What I want is justice. You've dishonored my house and almost ruined Ithaca with your greed. Stand up and fight." There were over 100 suitors and only 4 men in the doorway, but the suitors knew Odysseus's reputation, and their hands trembled as they drew their swords. Then the battle began. Oh, that does not look good. It was a bloody and terrifying fight. Odysseus allowed a few of the men to escape with their lives, but the others had to pay for their crimes, and by the time the battle was over, almost all of the suitors were dead. Odysseus gave orders for the bodies to be removed, and when the hall had been cleaned and purified with fire and sulfur, then everything was as it used to be. He sent Euryclea upstairs to announce that he was home. The old nurse ran to Penelope's room and leaned over her bed. "Wake up," she said. "Your prayers have been answered. Odysseus is here." Penelope lifted her head from the pillow. "Don't make fun of me," she said. "I'm serious," Euryclea insisted. "That old beggar was Odysseus in disguise, and now he's destroyed all your wicked suitors. Come and see." Penelope still didn't believe her. How could one man on his own defeat so many people? If the suitors have really been killed, it must have been done by one of the gods. Odysseus died a long time ago in a far-off foreign land. "That's nonsense." "What nonsense," Euryclea said. "Come downstairs and see." "I'll come see Telemachus," Penelope replied, "but I won't let that trickster take me in." She got out of bed and she walked to the top of the stairs. Looking down, she saw the great hall empty and clean at last, and with the fresh wind blowing through it. And there in the middle of the hall was Telemachus, standing shoulder to shoulder with the ragged beggar. Could that really be Odysseus? Penelope was afraid to believe it. She had been fooled too many times before and heard too many lies. Ignoring the beggar completely, she went straight to Telemachus and hugged him. "What's the matter with you?" said Telemachus. "Can't you see my father here? You've waited so long. Why don't you greet him now?" Penelope looked sideways at the beggar. If it is really my husband," she said, "I shall know soon enough. And Odysseus and I shared many secrets that no one else knows." Telemachus shook his head impatiently, but Odysseus stayed calm. He had waited a long time, and he was really wise and patient. "Give your mother a chance to make up her mind," he said to Telemachus. "Let's bathe and put on clean clothes, and then we'll ask the musicians to play some dancing music and see what happens." The two of them went away to wash off the blood from the fight, and Odysseus dressed in his own royal clothes and went out into the hall. Penelope was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames and listening to the music. Quietly, Odysseus sat down next to her. "What an odd woman you are," he murmured. "Here I am, back after 20 years, and you won't even speak to me. Any other woman would have thrown herself into her husband's arms." He raised his voice and called out to Euryclea, "Find me a bed of my own. I can't sleep with my wife. Her heart is as hard as iron." "What an odd man you are," Penelope replied. "I'm not hard-hearted, just careful. I've been faithful to Odysseus for 20 years, and I'm not going to let an impostor deceive me. You don't look like the man who sailed away 20 years ago." She turned around and nodded at Euryclea. "Do as our visitor asks. Move the great bed out of my husband's and my old room, and make it up for him down here." As she gave the order, she was watching the man beside her. Only she and Odysseus knew the secret of that bed. If this stranger stayed silent now, he was certainly not her husband. But he didn't stay silent. As soon as she finished speaking, Odysseus jumped up, roaring with anger. "Woman, what have you done? I built that bed around an ancient olive tree. The first bedpost was made from the tree trunk, still rooted in the ground. Have you let someone cut through that trunk and move our bed?" Penelope started trembling with joy. She burst into tears and threw herself in the arms of Odysseus. "It is you," she said. "Oh, Odysseus, it really is you. Don't be angry with me. No one has cut through the bedpost, but I've always been afraid that someone would come here and trick me by pretending to be you, so I thought up this plan to make sure I wouldn't be deceived, because no one knows the secrets of the bed except you and me." Odysseus hugged her hard, almost in tears himself. "How faithful and true you are," he said, "and how wise and beautiful. I am a happy man to come home to such a wife." "Promise me that you'll never leave again," Penelope said. Odysseus hesitated. "What's the matter?" said Penelope quickly. Odysseus was remembering the prophecy of the blind old Tiresias down in the land of the dead. "If you want to be free of Poseidon's curse, you must take another journey. Travel inland with an oar over your shoulder until you are far away from the sea. When someone mistakes your oar for a winnowing fan, sacrifice to Poseidon there, and then he will let you live in peace again." Slowly he repeated the words to Penelope. Her heart sank at the thought of losing him again, but she didn't waver. "We can't live peacefully," she said, "while one of the gods is your enemy. If that is the price of a happy old age, then you must make that journey." Odysseus hugged her again, knowing that there would be a peaceful end to all of his travels. Then he and Penelope walked up the stairs to their old room, beginning to tell each other the long story of what had happened in the last 20 years.